David, do you know of any podcasts that, well, actually, I'll just leave it at that. Do you know of any podcasts?
I know of one of them that is my personal favorite called Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast.
That is not what I was expecting you to say at all.
You were expecting me to say some other podcast?
Well, I mean, you're on this one, so I mean, that's great that it's your favorite too. Is that true? Is that really your favorite?
I don't know if I'm an impartial uh,
I see. Okay. Yeah.
source.
Well, we'll talk about this offline. So we'll circle back to that, as they say. But what are we doing today?
Well, we're actual evolutionary psychologists, and we're talking to actual evolutionary psychologists who do actual evolutionary psychology. Not quite our tagline, but it's close enough.
Isn't that? I thought that was our tagline.
Well, it's actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists.
What did you say? Should we
I
change
said
our
something
tagline?
like I
I think it
changed
was
it slightly.
better. I think it was more, had more
Should we
verbs
change
in
it?
it.
I
Well,
think maybe it's time.
we'll check the transcript later. Okay. Anyway, sorry to keep going on and on. Without further ado, here is our episode. Okay, David. Today we have a special guest who is where is David? Just said David. We should. That's we're
Safe
laughing.
bet, given all the Davids we interact with. Actually, Dan, another D name,
It is.
and Dan is our first philosopher that we've had on the
Mm,
podcast,
yeah.
and he's a wonderful and brilliant thinker, philosopher at the University of Sussex, which I screwed up during the beginning of the interview.
Not
I thought it was
Sheffield.
Sheffield.
Yeah, and for those
Um,
people at Sheffield, we really like Sheffield too. It's a wonderful
yeah,
institution.
yeah, it was a complimentary mistake, and that it was it's a wonderful institution. But also Sussex is a great institution as well, so far as I'm aware. Well, at the very least,
It
it
was
has
a
Dan
within
Williams, so
wonderful
that
institution
it must be
error.
a
I can
great
tell you all
institution.
about those. Yes, exactly.
Anyway, who is Dan Williams? He's a philosopher. He studies belief, misinformation, delusion, epistemology. We get into all sorts of things. It was a really mind-bending conversation. What is the nature of belief? What is the evolutionary psychology of belief? How do social forces and social status, how do they affect the things that we believe? What is a delusion? What does it mean to really believe something? We even get into Jordan Peterson and
We
whether we should
do.
think he's full of shit or not. It was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, I think what people believe and why the science of that gets into sort of some deep waters too, with people sort of feeling like being attacked too. And we talk about that a little bit too. So it's definitely a very interesting content in that sense too. Of one starts to sort of step on political ideas that in the same way you do, David. And I think that was an interesting part of the conversation too.
Yeah. So super fun conversation. I think you'll have a good time listening to it.
Sounds good. And yeah, listen for the everyone's opinion about Jordan Peterson.
All right.
All right,
We
we're
are
going.
here. We're here with the great Dan Williams, professor of philosophy at the University of Sheffield and
Sussex.
Sussex. Oh my God,
All
I'm so
right.
sorry.
No, that's all right.
Did I get that? Where did I get Sheffield? Was that?
They
It is a
sound
place in the
they sound
UK.
similar.
Oh, okay. I must have mixed it up with a different place. I
Yeah.
feel like someone else that's similar to you works there.
David,
Anyway,
David, you invited Dan on. Was there a different Dan Williams that you wanted to invite? Is this the
oh,
correct?
you know what? There are a lot of Dan
Okay,
Williams.
yeah.
I think
I'm
we
sorry. We're
got the
gonna have
wrong
to.
one.
All right.
We'll have to
Yeah.
make do with this Dan Williams.
All right. Good.
Anyway, and you're also the writer of the popular Substack, Conspicuous Cognition, which is a wonderful Substack. I
Mm,
recommend everyone subscribe to it. So Dan, you're our first philosopher on the
yeah.
show,
Wow.
Yeah. I know
which is
it's a
cool.
big lift. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're going to have to represent the entire discipline of philosophy.
Cool.
Um, I hope you're
It,
ready to take on that mantle.
yes. Defend it on first principles. We were actually both saying how we have all sort of interacted online but never met in person.
Mm,
So I feel like this is sort of like meeting in person. Although we're still not. I don't know. Is this online or in person?
it's both.
Okay, that's the philosopher.
That's the definitive answer.
Great,
Yeah.
it's both good. So Dan, really great to have you here. I know a lot of the work that you do involves. I kind of think about your work similar to David's work which is a compliment to David. So, um, but uh, but it's sort of in this category of there's a social logic to lots of stuff that's maybe hidden and hasn't been appreciated. Um, do you think that is a fair characterization of your work? And if so, can you maybe, for people who haven't come across your work, sort of talk a little bit about how you view, if you're stuck in an elevator with somebody and they want to know more than you're a philosopher informed by evolution, um, how do you think about sort of what's the main line of what you do?
That's a good question. I suppose the overarching question that I'm interested in is why do people believe what they do, especially when they seem to believe things that are strange or irrational, outright bizarre, delusional. That's a sort of overarching question. It's not the only question that I'm interested in, but it tends to be connected to many of the other things that I'm interested in. And there is this sort of view I have, which is very general, that human beings are these intensely social animals. And most of the features of human psychology and our behavior that seem otherwise sort of strange or self-defeating or irrational or paradoxical actually make a lot more sense once you situate that psychology within the context of the fact that we're social animals, competing for prestige, trying to cultivate a good reputation, trying to form alliances that will advance our interests, and so on. And I think that then is really important when it comes to understanding belief specifically. So I think that many of the sort of strange things that we believe in domains like religion and ideology, and often what's thought of in terms of self-deception, is sort of best illuminated by understanding the kinds of social goals that we have. And that's also where my sort of interest in evolutionary theory comes from, which I think is quite unusual for someone in academic philosophy, and especially unusual in the sort of humanities more generally. Because I think evolutionary theory gives you a kind of important toolkit for thinking about the ways in which the fact that we're social animals has shaped the kinds of minds that we have and the kinds of motivations that we have. I guess at the most abstract level, that would be the kind of idea.
That's fantastic. You mentioned philosophy and you mentioned belief. Um, in my understanding, and I'm going to like qualify everything I say with, I'm an amateur philosopher. I'm a happy amateur for philosophy, but belief, the idea of belief and what it is and how it works, has been a long-standing thing in philosophy. Do you view taking an evolutionary approach, in particularly what you just described, as diverging in important and interesting ways? Maybe I'm leading by saying interesting, but do you think that's a different way of approaching the idea of belief and what it's for and its function in philosophy?
It's difficult to say. Um, I think that historically, there hasn't been a sharp distinction between philosophy and psychology and social theory. And historically, when I think many philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, and so on have tried to understand the ways in which we form beliefs and why we form beliefs that we do, I don't think they've been sufficiently sensitive to the fact that we're social animals. So, in that sense, I think pushing this sort of social perspective is at odds with lots of theory, both in philosophy and elsewhere, when it comes to understanding belief. But it's difficult. I mean, lots of philosophy is often concerned with what you might think of as sort of conceptual questions, or maybe metaphysical questions, depending on which way you look at it. Like, what even is it to believe something? And that's just this really deep and complex question. And I think in many ways, we still don't have a particularly good answer to that. Because this term belief gets used to refer to lots of different things that are different from each other in very complex ways. And so, for example, I believe I'm talking to you two. I might also believe, let's say, that capitalism is an unjust system. I might believe that there's a supernatural agent that monitors my behavior and punishes me for bad things. We use belief to capture all of these different things, and it's not really at all obvious that they are the same thing,
Right.
except insofar as there's a sincere commitment to the truth of a proposition. But I think even there, I mean, we can get into this, and this is something, David, I know that you're really interested in as well.
Mhm.
even there, I think the fact that we're social animals competing for status and trying to, boost our reputation and trying to influence other people in advantageous ways, that's relevant to understanding a lot of that complexity. I think if we weren't social animals to the degree that we are, then the concept of belief would be a lot less complicated and a lot more transparent.
Mhm.
So I think when it comes to, even chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas, I mean, these are social animals, although not social, I think, in the ways and to the degree that human beings are animals. They've got cognitive mechanisms that function to track their environment, their material
Mhm.
and social environment in ways that help them achieve their goals and so on. And we've got that as well. I think that's the kind of the dominant thing that's going on when it comes to what we sometimes think of as belief. It's like modeling those aspects of the world which are relevant to our practical goals.
Mhm.
But once you get into religion, politics, ideology, aspects of culture, there's something very different going on when it comes to talking about belief, which you're not going to be able to understand in terms of this sort of basic model which applies in almost every other case, which is forming beliefs to track how things are.
Right. And
Mhm.
so just to summarize, and then I'll let David, who's chomping at the bit here, I think, but if what I hear you're saying is that there's almost been sort of there's this idea of sort of philosophy counteracts this naive realist idea that sort of like things just are the way they are, or psychology does. So the idea of naive realism is that the world is the way it just appears to us. And what we know from psychology and philosophy is that we have all this machinery mediating the relationship between the real world and what we experience. So visual illusions being a great example of that, that we see things that aren't objectively sort of there. It's a function of how our machinery works. And what I'm hearing you say is that both people, just every day, all of us sort of intuitively, but then also the scientific community has been sort of not maybe naive realism, but sort of socially naive in a sense, or we haven't appreciated the social complexity of the idea of belief, for example.
I think that's right. Yeah. And I think there are interesting questions about why um, theorists historically have not been sufficiently sensitive to the social sort of motivations that underpin a lot of what we believe. And also, they haven't, I think, been sufficiently sensitive to the role of strategic social motivations in governing our behavior. I know that this is a big part of your work, David, thinking
Yeah.
about cynicism and so on.
Mhm.
So it's not as if I think it's just a sort of an ordinary theoretical omission. The fact
Right.
that people have not been sensitive to the importance of things like social signaling and things like advocacy and propaganda when it comes to biasing how we view the world and giving rise to these sort of complexities when it comes to belief. It's not as if I think it's just an ordinary sort of gap in the knowledge or theoretical omission. I think there are probably interesting things to say about why it is
Right.
that it's often a
Yeah.
little bit awkward to acknowledge the
Mm,
the the
Mhm.
role of things like status competition and reputation management and propaganda in shaping this domain of belief.
mm.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think given that we are so fixated on signaling various things to one another about our identities, our loyalties, our traits, it is often in our interests to conceal the fact that we're signaling those things at all, because signaling
Right.
those things can itself become a cue of something bad about you, that you're narcissistic, you're selfish, you are insecure, and needy of attention. For example, there are all sorts of inferences that we draw about each other. And the inferences that we draw about status seekers, about signalers, about attention seekers, those are often bad. And so often the social games we play have to be played in the cover of darkness, or at least without becoming common knowledge among the players. And I think that might explain why it has taken so long for us to realize the social games we're playing, is because one of the moves in those social games is trying to hide the fact that it's a game. In order to effectively compete for political power, you have to conceal the fact that your primary motive is, raw power seeking. In order to compete for status, you have to conceal the fact that you're merely interested in status. So I think that that might be what's going on here, why it has taken us so long to explain our beliefs in terms of social motives, because it is often in our interest to conceal those motives, which often serves a deeper social motive.
Yeah, I think that's a massive part of what's going on. But it's interesting. I mean, if you think about the sort of So just to be concrete with an example, I mean, if you think
Hmm.
about something like self-deception, human
Yeah.
beings often seem to be motivated to believe things, and we can get into this maybe in more depth, but I think, you know, in many cases that's boiling down to sort of one of two social motivations. Either it's sort of propaganda or advocacy, so we're sort of motivated to push particular claims and narratives, and then we end up kind of internalizing them,
Hmm.
or it's to do with social signaling and sort of reputation management. So we want to advertise certain kinds of qualities and allegiances that we've got.
Hmm.
Um, and then that biases in us in the direction of certain kinds of beliefs, which are conducive to doing that. But what's interesting is, throughout so much of the history of philosophy and also psychology, and then even when you get sort of Freudian psychoanalysis, which takes seriously this idea that there are these kind of hidden motives, so much of it is this sort of you can't handle the truth model of self-deception, right? It,
Hmm.
it,
Yeah.
it acknowledges the idea that we're sort of motivated to believe things for reasons independent of their truth, that there are these practical motivations and interests which shape and distort and bias what we believe. But there's even with sort of Freudianism and the sort of psychoanalytic tradition, even when there's this willingness to sort of, dig deeper and look at these hidden motivations, it's all this sort of, inward facing,
Mm.
intrapsychic, emotion regulation, the defense mechanisms of the ego and so on. So even when you've got
Hmm.
what looks kind of ostensibly like a kind of a willingness to be quite cynical, there's not the willingness to be as cynical as I think is needed, which is to
Yes.
go one step further. And it's not about, protecting your ego, and it's not about believing things that make you feel good and protect your self-esteem and so on. It's winning these, social games. It's propaganda. It's advocacy. So I think there's definitely something to that idea, David, that you know, there's something awkward about drawing attention to these things. So that even when you get these intellectual traditions, which on the surface, they look like they're very cynical, they don't actually go the kind of whole way to draw attention
Hmm.
to strategic social motivations as means of sort of biasing the way in which we think about the world.
Yes, I love that distinction, where instead of saying that the goal is to impress you, the goal is inwardly focused. It's to feel good about myself.
Right.
And what's interesting about that is we somehow, for some reason, view that as less problematic than to
Hmm.
be concerned with impressing you or being superior to you. If I'm doing it
Yeah.
for me to feel good about myself, then it's like we can relate to that. It's not that bad. But if I'm doing it just to gain status or just to impress you or just to look good in your eyes, then it becomes like even ickier. And so I love that point that like yes we are somewhat cynical in that we acknowledge that we care about advertising various features of ourselves, but we're not cynical enough because the target of those signals is often ourselves, when really the target should be other people, because that is the adaptive target. If we're thinking in evolutionary terms, that those are the things that matter for our fitness. What other people think of us was a huge selection pressure for our ancestors. What we thought of ourselves was not necessarily a selection pressure. It's hard to imagine how it would be. So I really love that distinction. You mentioned self-deception. That is a huge topic both in philosophy and psychology. I'm still struggling to wrap my head around it myself. I think I'm starting to see how it works, but how are you thinking about self-deception these days? Are you skeptical of the term? Do you think it's a useful term?
So I tend not to use the term,
Hmm.
except for the fact that in sort of ordinary discourse, I think it captures something that people are quite familiar with, so it can be helpful in that way. Oh yeah, of course, self-deception. You believe things for reasons independent of their truth, or you're sort of biased in how you view the world by practical interests and emotions and so on. But I think it does, raises all of these, traditional paradoxes. How can you deceive yourself? What's playing the role of the deceiver? What's playing the role of the deceived? And often it
Hmm.
comes with quite, implausible psychological models as well. I mean,
Hmm.
the way that I prefer to think about it, as I mentioned, is we've got these sort of two motivations or goals, which I think are highly relevant to understanding what's going on when we form these, biased beliefs, when we form these strange belief systems and narratives and so on. One of these is, you can call it propaganda or you can call it advocacy, but it's just the idea that we're motivated to spread ideas, claims, narratives such that if other people accept them, it will promote our interests, right? So if I can convince you two that I'm this generous, pro-social, kind, fair-minded person, I've got a sort of standing motivation to advocate for my interests in that way, to propagate that kind of message. And I think for reasons that we can get into, and I think it's really fucking complicated exactly what's going on, we tend to internalize our propaganda.
Yeah.
That's the way that I sort of prefer to put it, rather than
Yeah.
saying we deceive ourselves, because I think that is more confusing than just the idea that when we've got this standing motivation to propagate messages, we tend to internalize those. Although even that I think is sort of subject to various constraints. And then similarly, I think we've got these motivations to engage in reputation management, to signal that we've got attractive qualities and allegiances, and that can shape our outward behavior. It can shape, how we dress, how we talk, the ways in which we conduct ourselves, what teams we cheer for, and so on. And I think that can also shape what beliefs we form. So I think these signaling motivations can also bias what beliefs we form. That's the way that I tend to talk about it these days, rather than thinking in terms of self-deception. But if you're just using self-deception as this sort of catch-all term for the idea that our practical, philosophers might say, non-epistemic motivations bias belief, then I'm happy with it.
Yeah, there's like that joke, how did you think of something smart, like a smart thing? And it was like, well, I thought of somebody smarter than me and I imagined what they would do, right? And that has all the paradox of, you can't exceed your own intelligence by thinking of somebody smarter than you, right? You are as smart as you are. And so the criticism, the sophisticated criticism of self-deception, like Rob Kurzban paper a while ago, like there is no self, right? Like that
Mm.
it's, or what are you calling the self, right? And I mean, I think the sophisticated argument is there's like the talky or PR part of the phenotype, the body envelope. But yeah, if you kind of exactly, if you sort of unpack it or poke on it even a little bit, it sort of it bears more unpacking than just the idea of self-deception, I think, historically. But so I think that's people have had that similar sort of notion, and I think that would what you just said sort of would agree with that idea.
Mm.
Yeah, no, it's a great example of how folk psychology or our intuitive, naive ideas about the mind are, I think, stymieing progress in academic psychology. And Dave has written a lot about this because we have this intuitive idea that there is a singular self in the head that thinks things, attends to things, remembers things, and these processes are unitary. We had a whole episode on this a while back. This is what is leading to these paradoxes, that there is a singular self that can deceive itself. But we would never have gotten into this mess if we just stayed at the mechanistic level of what are the different mechanisms in the mind, which mechanisms have access to which kinds of information. Once we stay at that level, there are no paradoxes, and it becomes much more intelligible. So I think it's a really good example of how we need to realize what level of analysis we're at when we're
Right.
thinking about these issues, and drop down to the mechanistic level to get a better and deeper understanding of what's going on. So you mentioned how you don't like the word self-deception. I agree. I'm not a fan of it either. But there has been a reemergence of a different kind of distinction that's sort of related to self-deception. And it's the idea that there are two kinds of beliefs. And they've been referred to in different things in the literature. So Neil Van Leeuwen has referred to them as credences versus beliefs. Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber have referred to the distinction between reflective beliefs and intuitive beliefs. I saw one philosopher refer to the latter kind as schmeliefs, as opposed to beliefs, as they're not real beliefs, they don't matter. And so and we sort of intuitively recognize this. We refer to, like, he's a true believer, she's a true believer, versus,
Mm.
they're just paying lip service. And Neil Van Leeuwen gets into the idea that we often recognize this distinction when we talk about I think X versus I believe X. Think sort of implies a genuine belief that it's guiding your behavior. Believe X is more of a social connotation, that maybe, I believe this to show what kind of person I am, or what my values are, or what group I belong to, rather than it's like actually guiding my behavior in a concrete way. And so this, I think, is one of the most interesting and important distinctions that has come up in the last decade, and I'm still trying to grapple with it and what its implications are. But do you buy this distinction that there are different kinds of belief, and that some beliefs, guide our behavior in day-to-day decisions and in concrete ways, and some of them are kind of inert? They just kind of sit there and we may, believe we believe them. We may think we believe them, but
Right.
they're not actually driving us in any real concrete way. Do you buy that distinction? Do you think it's important? How are you approaching that topic?
So what I think is true is that there are these cases in which we're sincerely committed to the truth of a proposition. God is always watching. Um,
Mhm.
uh, Socialism will usher in a utopia. Um, there's a crocodile spirit that will hunt me down if I don't share my meat with fellow members of the group. The belief that studied by Manvir Singh.
Mhm.
These are cases in which I think people are sincere, but as you say, the belief is often very strangely compartmentalized. I mean, my
Yeah.
favorite example of this is from Dan Dennett, where he points out that nobody would ever masturbate in front of their parents, right?
Mhm.
But they'll say they think God is always watching, and they think God is this omnipotent, all-seeing agent who will send them to hell if they masturbate, and yet they'll happily, masturbate when they think this. Uh, uh, God is always watching, which suggests that that commitment that they've got is not really functioning as an ordinary world modeling belief. And I think there are so many
Mhm.
examples of that. If you look at conspiracy theories, when
Mhm.
somebody sort of intuitively thinks that there's a conspiracy going on, if you live in North Korea and the elites in your society are just actually conspiring in really horrific ways against your interests, as Hugo Mercier points out, like under those conditions, you typically don't want to go out and just advertise your commitment to this conspiracy theory because it's going to be incredibly
Mhm.
detrimental to your interests. But in a country like the United States, you've got these sort of proponents of QAnon who claim to believe that there's this sort of all-powerful deep state that will crush them if they speak out against the regime, and yet they feel no sort of strangeness in the fact that they're advertising their commitment to the belief in that way. So
Mhm.
these are there's so many cases like that where you've got a kind of sincere commitment to the truth of some idea. It's not as if I think people are lying in these cases for the most part.
Mhm. Yeah.
And yet it is just strangely compartmentalized from their sort of world model in general and from the kinds
Mhm.
of behaviors that they're undertaking. The question then is, how do you make sense of that psychologically? And you're right,
Mhm.
different theorists have proposed different ways of trying to understand that. So there's the kind
Mhm.
of Sperber idea of, I think it was at first sort of factual beliefs and symbolic beliefs, and then it's intuitive and
Mhm.
reflective beliefs. You've got Neil
Mhm.
van Leeuwen's idea, where he thinks this differences between sort of factual beliefs and what I think he calls religious credences, and he thinks that's sort of
Mhm.
closer to imagining than a sort of ordinary world modeling belief.
Mhm.
My sense is we still don't fully understand exactly what's going on there. We know that there's something that needs to be explained,
Mhm.
but in terms of having a kind of really satisfactory mechanistic understanding of the actual psychological processes that drive that, I think it's just really complicated. And another
Mhm.
thing that complicates it is, it seems like with many of these beliefs, which you might call merely reflective beliefs, or what Van Leeuwen calls religious credences, it seems like internalization sort of comes in degrees in a way which is
Mhm.
also strange. So if you've got
Yeah.
someone who's got a kind of identity defining conviction, and they're, let's say that they're a Christian, they go to church every other week or something when they can remember, and they're going to hold these religious beliefs in a way that's kind of light. It's not going to make much of a difference to their behavior and their decision making in general. But if you take someone who's in a really kind of close knit, intense, hyper cooperative cult where they're constantly monitoring signals of cult loyalty, coalition allegiance, and so on,
Mhm.
often you will find the beliefs much more internalized in terms of their behavior. In some
Mhm.
contexts, you get these cases of collective suicide in the cult where you've got these really, what seem like incredibly internalized beliefs and narratives. And if you just have this idea that there are just two different kinds of mental states, factual beliefs and religious credences, I wonder whether you can explain that kind of variability. I genuinely don't know.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. I mean, even I think like, and this is getting to, I think taking an evolutionary approach and a psychological approach is that we don't even know, like if we know like David is bleeding, right? Like just that representation, even a mundane one, a lot of the psychology of the inferences that follow still aren't very well studied. So like, the
Mm,
fact that in us there's a representation of our relationship, the physical fact of the matter of one of us should probably go do something to get to help David. He's bleeding. There's representations of sort of like the schedule will be put on hold for what we're doing, and what will the social consequences be? What if we don't intervene upon David? There's all these sort of what cognitive science call, or scientists call, inference engines, or computer scientists or AI researchers call these like, or what Marvin Minsky called frames, where it's just sort of like an event representation. It almost sounds stilted to talk about it, but in order to actually build a computer, whether it's squishy or hard, to actually represent current state of the world and future states of the world, or what follows from a representation, we still don't know that, even for something as normal and mundane as David's bleeding, let alone something like, God is a spaghetti monster, or we should all kill ourselves because, the space saucer is coming, and, we're going to have a better life elsewhere. So I don't think it's surprising that we still don't know a lot, because, I mean, as I read the literature, a lot of the point that you're making, Dan, and that I think we're all making, is that we just have to move from it. There's not enough structure in the world to tell these things apart, and we have to appeal to what is the underlying psychology. That's kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think I completely agree with that. I would just add that you can get far in some ways in thinking about high level human behavior, thinking about broad uh, patterns in behavior, how people interact, the sorts of things they do, the narratives that they endorse, without having to settle those questions about underlying mechanisms and how everything actually works.
Right.
So I think that I think there's very good reason to believe that people um, to some significant degree, often internalize their propaganda. They're motivated to advocate for a claim, and that tends to shift their private beliefs in the direction of that claim. And similarly, as we're saying, I think there are these cases where there's good reason to believe that somebody's ideology, a narrative that they're committed to, performs these social signaling functions, and it's sort of strangely compartmentalized in their mental life. We can say that, and I think that can be true and that can be important, at the same time as we just put our hands up and say we don't fully understand exactly how that works in terms of the underlying psychology. And you're right. I mean, even when it comes to sort of ordinary inference, and we're setting aside all of these complex social dynamics, so complicated to figure out exactly what's going on. But one of the things that makes it even more complicated in these social cases is, even when these beliefs are sort of compartmentalized, because I think their function is very often social. I believe this, I endorse this set of religious convictions because I want to signal that I'm a committed member of my group. There's some sense in which that comes about and out of motivations to convince you that I really believe it, which
Hmm.
creates all of these extra additional worries when it comes to and puzzles when it comes to explaining what's going on, because there's some sense in which you don't want to be transparent as the individual who's got that kind of belief. You're
Yeah.
precisely acting in ways to convince other people that you really believe it. So it's just
Yeah.
Yeah.
so complicated, I think,
Yeah,
exactly
natural
what's going on there.
selection designed you to not to foil future psychologists, basically designed the
Yeah.
Yeah,
mind
yeah,
in this respect.
yeah.
You're biting off a really hard part of human phenotype here.
Yeah, how do you tell the difference between fake belief and real belief when often the agent is trying as hard as they can to convince you that it's real belief? And what is the difference between trying really hard to convince you that I believe X and believing that you're going to scrutinize me uh, for that and truly believing X? They seem to be pretty hard to empirically distinguish because both would lead to the same types of behavior that would lend evidence to the idea that I believe X. So it's a really thorny and difficult problem. The way I think of it is in terms of cues and signals and how unstable the former are and how they can slide into the latter. So, for those who aren't familiar with the distinction, a cue is something that we use to guide our behavior. It's X is correlated with Y. People who comb their hair are more organized and conscientious. So I'm going to hire the people who neatly comb their hair. So that's a cue. A signal is you're intending to convey information to someone else. Or in the case of biology, the organism is evolving to convey information. So one is the information was not intended to be conveyed. Or was not evolved to be conveyed. And then the other, the information is evolved or intended to be conveyed. That's a signal. And so what's weird about our species is because we're so obsessed with getting inside each other's heads, and anticipating what other people are going to think we think, that cues are really unstable. As soon as I pick up on the cue that people with neatly combed hair are organized and conscientious, I now have a social strategic incentive to comb my hair because I think that you're going to think that I'm conscientious
Mm,
and organized. And all of a sudden, once I start doing that, then the cue may no longer be valid. It may be that people who are really sloppy and disorganized uh, comb their hair to dupe people. And that can lead to a lot of dynamism and arms races between deceivers and deceived. It can lead to status games collapsing and reemerging in antithetical forms. And so, what I think might be going on with this distinction between belief and schmelief or whatever is that beliefs are really powerful cues that we try to use to anticipate others' behaviors, to anticipate others' allegiances and loyalties and traits. And because they're such powerful cues, there is thus a powerful incentive to transform them into signals,
mm,
to imitate uh, the superficial features of belief, to convince others that we truly believe something, as you put it. And once I am motivated enough to really convince you that I believe something, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between true belief and what I might call pseudo belief. I think a lot of
mm,
our beliefs are pseudo beliefs, and that the goal is to make it difficult to tell the difference between real belief and fake belief. And that is why it's so hard for psychologists to tell the difference, because that difficulty is by design.
mm,
It's tantamount to other kinds of mimicry we see in the biological world, where a non-poisonous butterfly will mimic the features of a poisonous butterfly to avoid predation. And just as it is very difficult for predators to tell the difference, it is often difficult for biologists to tell the difference. I think a similar phenomenon is happening with us, where we have a kind of belief mimicry, and that makes it really hard to tell the difference between true belief and fake belief. What do you? I mean,
that
that's sort of how I've been thinking of it lately. I'm curious what
that's
you think
great.
about that. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I love this term, pseudo-belief. I'm going to steal that. That's
Oh,
great.
cool.
Actually, that's
Uh,
that's that's better than the other ones in literature, I think. Just thinking out loud. I mean, I guess so as you said, there's going to be this sort of puzzle of what distinguishes, someone who's just, let's say, just lying.
mhm.
They know
Yeah.
what they privately think, and they're just saying that they believe something.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe they don't even feel bad about the discrepancy because they're in a social context where it's not like anyone's going to like hold them accountable.
Hmm.
Um, so what distinguishes that kind of case from my understanding of what you said is in the case of pseudo beliefs, it's not quite that. It's not that someone
Hmm.
is just deliberately misrepresenting what they think. There is a kind
Hmm.
of psychological state there,
Hmm.
which is not just about misrepresenting deliberately the state of one's own mind. And it does seem important to think that something like that is going on, not just because, it often seems like people are sincere, because you might say, well, they could be faking that. But it does seem like in many of these contexts, people are willing to act on these beliefs, at least in some ways, in some contexts. In some cases, they're willing to sort of incur costs as a consequence of
Hmm.
acting upon them.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think we need this sort of this construct, which is not quite a ordinary world modeling belief, and it's not quite a mere performance or deception. It's sort of something in between.
Hmm.
Is that what you're meaning by pseudo belief? Something that kind of exists in between those two things, or?
No, I think so. So even if I do something that's really costly to
Mm,
demonstrate that I believe something, that could still be
yeah,
part of the signal, right?
yeah,
In order to convince you that I truly believe something, I have to
mm,
incur a cost. It could be an honest, I mean, that's the thing though. It's not an honest signal because I don't truly believe it. But I think that those kinds of signals can still be stable if what I'm signaling to you is correlated with something that is beneficial to you. So let's say I don't truly believe that the spider god is going to smite me if I steal from the group or whatever. But my belief in that is correlated with my loyalty to the group.
mm,
So in that case, deceiving you that I believe in the spider god that is still going to benefit you, even though it's a deceptive signal, because that's going to endear me to you. You're going to welcome me into the group, and you'll be right to do so because I truly am more loyal. And so the deceptive signal can survive because it is correlated with something else that makes the signaling system mutually beneficial. So that's another piece to this that I'm continuing to think about is that a lot of the time, deceptive signals don't necessarily need to fall apart if they're correlated with something else that's true, that's valuable.
Mm. But do you not think that there is a psychological difference? I mean, just think of sort of two cases. You know, if
Hmm.
I uh, let's say I'm a spy, trying to infiltrate some ideological community. And
Hmm.
as part of that, I really need to convince other people in that community that I hold their beliefs. It says like a group
Hmm.
of neo-Nazis or something like that.
Yeah.
You're right that, I might need to like pay costs
Yeah.
to credibly signal to these other people in the community that I hold the ideological convictions.
Hmm.
But nevertheless, this is a case in which I'm consciously aware of the fact that I don't really believe it. It's a kind of
Mm.
pretense. It's this kind of like active
Yeah.
fiction which I'm maintaining. That seems
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
different from the psychology of someone who's actually in the community and is actually committed and loyal to the community. There seems to be a sense in which, even though I think these social incentives are playing an important role in regulating, what they believe and how they think about the world and the evidence that they seek out and so on. It's not a self-conscious deception in a way that it would be if I
Yes.
were. I mean, I'm thinking out loud here, but that seems like an important
Yeah. Yeah.
distinction that we want to capture.
Yeah. Definitely. I think what's going on there is that the spy is aware that they don't believe the beliefs.
Mm,
But I think often in our quest to convince others that we believe our beliefs, we convince ourselves as well. And so
mm,
often we put ourselves in a state where we believe that we believe X, but we don't actually believe X because we're so zealous about convincing others that we believe X. Or sorry, that we're zealous about convincing others that we believe X, that we convince ourselves as part of that process. I think that is what might be going on. I don't know,
I
but I'm still. This is obviously a very complicated
yeah,
topic,
yeah.
and I'm still kind of figuring it out. But yeah, what do you think of that idea?
So I think that that's Dennett's idea about religion, that in many of these
Mm.
cases, you've got, as you say, you've got a kind of belief in belief. So it's like you
Yeah,
don't believe it, but you sort of become
yeah,
convinced that you believe it. So there's this weird
yes,
second order thing going on.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's one of the candidate explanations in this area, which really needs to be explored and
yeah,
tested. Just as I think the kind of Van Leeuwen picture also needs to be tested, and the
mm-hmm,
Sperber, like Mercier one. This is what I
mm-hmm,
mean when I say there's something going on here, which I think lots of
yeah,
people are getting at in lots of different ways. And
mm-hmm,
each of the different stories, I think, has their own kind of advantages, and there are certain kinds of puzzles they run into. And I think it's just going to require more research to really
yeah,
definitively figure out what's going on. But I will add, I mean, I think another thing that really complicates this is in some cases, I think these pseudo beliefs, let's call them these
yeah,
things which we're forming for social reasons.
yeah,
As part of that, we bias how we seek out and recall evidence, right? And as a consequence, we can end up becoming sincerely persuaded of that of that thing, right? So
yeah,
I think this is a lot of what happens when it comes to advocacy biasing what people actually take to be the case. If I said to you, look,
yeah,
you've got 5 minutes, I'm going to give you $1,000 if you can make an incredibly persuasive case that Obama was the best president in US history, right?
mm-hmm,
Well, in that time, you're going to be searching through memory, recalling
mm-hmm,
all of this information you have, which is in line with that conclusion. You're going to be thinking up good arguments and so on. And
mm,
after that process, even though you're sort of self-consciously, you know that you're advocating for something, you end up with all of this evidence, which is in line with this conclusion, which can end up sincerely persuading you of that thing. And I think that's
mm-hmm,
often what happens in these cases of internalizing our propaganda. It's not so much as like Robert Trivers famously argued, that we're sort of deceiving ourselves so that we can deceive others. That might be what's going on in some cases. But I think
mm-hmm,
often in the process of trying to be a propagandist and advocate for something, we just end up almost accidentally becoming convinced of it because we're so biased in terms of the evidence and the arguments we recruit to argue for that case. So I think this is why in sort of the case of lawyers when they know that they're being paid to advocate, let's say, for their client, or they know that it's their job to argue that the accused is guilty. But I think there's some evidence that they actually end up becoming
Yeah.
sincerely convinced in the direction that they're incentivized to advocate. And the reason for that is just that, or I think at
Mhm.
least one potential reason for that, which complicates this whole discussion, is even though like in the first instance they've got this purely practical non-epistemic motivation, because it's going to bias the evidence that they end up with, they're going to end up becoming sort of intuitively convinced of a certain kind of view in a way that
Mhm.
wouldn't have happened unless they had that practical motivation. Apologies if that wasn't particularly clear. That's me sort of
No,
thinking
no,
out loud.
that was perfectly clear. I get that story. I still don't quite buy it because it's kind of puzzling to me that if I have a strategic reason to convince you of X, it's kind of puzzling to me that that some part of the mind wouldn't recognize that and recognize that my search for evidence is biased and take that into account when
Mm,
updating my actual beliefs. It seems like a well-designed system would, when trying to convince others of X, recognize that fact and correct for that when updating its own internal beliefs. Or at least
I,
that's if we're thinking like good adaptationists, I would expect there to be design for that end, so that in the same way that if you're trying to fight someone else, you don't want to accidentally hit yourself. If you're trying to persuade and deceive others, you don't want to accidentally persuade and deceive yourself as part of that objective, or at least so that's why I find it a bit implausible that because it sounds like what you're saying is, when we're trying to fight other people, we sometimes hit ourselves and hurt ourselves accidentally. It seems
mm,
like we should have evolved to avoid doing that as much as possible,
Can
right?
I actually
Yeah,
push on this a little
yeah,
bit? I mean,
sorry.
just
yeah,
but I think to be good adaptationists too, we have to include the what is the function of our own internalization of the belief.
Mm,
hmm
And
yes,
might
yes, okay,
not be that it's just this propositional of what is true. If the underlying design of the system is accept as a belief, though when there's a good argument available, then if that's the underlying reason for it, right? So it's not that
right,
I'm I've punched myself. It's that the underlying structure is different than believe what's true, quote unquote. It's a much more operationalized thing of what's the
yeah,
logic for why I'm accepting a belief. And if the design of that system is when a good argument and a lot of evidence is provided, represent that into quote unquote your beliefs, then you would get that as part of the design. And I mean, one
mm,
would have to be functionalist about why that would be. It could be some,
sure,
but I think
yeah.
that would be, I think that's the part to push on that doesn't make it punching yourself. Dan, yeah, sorry, go
I
ahead.
get that. I get that.
Yeah.
But wouldn't a better design be believe X when there are good arguments and evidence, unless you have strategic reasons to present one-sided arguments and evidence for
yeah.
X, in which case don't believe X, or at least discount it. That would be a better design system than the former system.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I mean, I think
Yeah.
somewhere in Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday, he pushes back on that line of reasoning a little bit precisely for this sort of reason. Like, if you
Yeah.
actually come across a really good argument for something, even if your
Yeah.
search has been biased by non-epistemic considerations, you're going to take it into consideration. But I totally see the force of your point, David, which is that, well, you should correct for the fact that
Yeah.
the search is biased.
hmm
So what I'd say is, I think you're right. There's a sort of maybe let's say like a prima facie adaptationist presumption against this being the case, maybe. Although,
hmm
like for the
Yeah.
reasons we've talked about, it's complicated,
Yeah.
and I still don't know entirely
Sure.
what to think about that.
Yeah.
But it could be that this is just a kind of kludgy aspect of the mind. I think you have to be open to
Yep.
that. And then it
hmm
could be as well that as people like Trivers have argued, there is in addition some sort of like positive value that can sometimes come from internalizing it. So
hmm
even though it can come with costs, it comes with benefits, and that complicates it. Like for example, if you do sincerely internalize it, you become a more effective advocate for the position,
hmm
etc.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally take the point that if it seems like you wouldn't expect this to be the case if you've got this kind of adaptationist assumption, which I think is a really important point. But again, it's one of those. I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I
hmm
still don't know exactly what to think. Because I think
hmm
another thing that really complicates this is my sense is that at least in some cases, people do kind of incur costs. Like it is somewhat maladaptive to internalize the views
Hmm.
that they're advocating for, and yet they still do it.
Yeah.
Which makes me a little bit more receptive to the sort of this is a kludgy aspect of our psychology or a byproduct of other things or
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like that.
Could
Hmm.
it be that just argument is a service for coalitional entrepreneurship? So, I mean, just baked in intrinsically to a mental representation is if I've come up with a good argument, that's just sort of probabilistically, this is a social item that's going to be a coalitional opportunity. It might not go, but I mean, that would be one explanation
Hmm.
for it is kludgy, but it's sort of it's intrinsically social.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So the idea there is that truly believing something serves a useful coalitional purpose, and that it helps coordinate the group and or around, say, a shared goal. Is that the idea?
It's a more of a David Pinsoff idea, which is
Yeah.
that if I have arranged arguments
Yeah.
that I think are good and I model that will convince other people,
Yeah.
that whenever that is tripped, that I have that representation, I have that I've come up with it, or I have access to that,
Hmm.
that is part of the this is a status acquisition opportunity because there's
Hmm.
such an interest in arguments as coordination devices for
Hmm.
social coordination. So this is a David Pinsoff idea. Um,
Okay.
David.
I think I understand
Yeah,
what you're getting at.
yeah,
Let me see if I can repeat to you what I
sure.
think you're getting at,
Yeah.
which is that there's one way to design a mind to believe things, which is just believe things that have the most evidence, the best arguments, and if there are biases in the production of evidence and arguments, take that into account, and that's like one way to form beliefs. But another way to form beliefs is to think about what are the arguments and evidence that other people in your culture will find plausible and will likely to be convinced of.
Yeah, that's a way of putting it. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
believe whatever your social and cultural group will likely join you in believing, regardless of whether it has good evidence or good arguments for it. And the argument there would be there are adaptive benefits to coordination. And often it is more important to coordinate with other members of your group than it is to coordinate with reality. So if you see a belief that it has strong intuitive appeal to other members of your cultural group, believe that, because that's going to help you coordinate with other members of your group and perhaps give you status for having come up with that belief, as the originator of it. Is that basically what you're
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
at?
I mean, I think it includes other things, but I think like the existence of logical fallacies in argument
Hmm.
and what those are
Yeah.
descriptions of exactly when those
Mm.
exist. The existence of an ad hominem attack, the existence
Yeah.
of appealing to common knowledge or to the group, I think it precisely exists because this happens all the time. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. I believe something if there are social benefits to believing it or social costs for disbelieving it.
Right. It's like what
Um,
Bacon called like the idols of the tribe, right? Or like, he had like these idols, right? Where it was sort of like Francis Bacon had, why do people believe, why do scientists or philosophers at the time or natural philosophers hold the beliefs that they hold? And he's like, it's stupid because like they're just going around like it's a status game, right? Or like it's because
mm.
everybody believes it and they're just sort of like who's high status. And so there's this beautiful like literature in the history of sort of people arguing for science above and beyond these status games, like logical fallacies, like Bacon's idols of the tribe or the species or the cave. I mean, there's like, they're all different ones, but I think they all exist. They're a documentation informally of like the presence of these adaptations, right?
Hmm.
Mm. Yeah. It's almost like an example is like so I think Jordan Peterson is full of shit, right? But I haven't done
We're,
my
we're
due
not
diligence.
gonna we're not gonna we're not gonna edit that out.
We're not going to edit that out. But like, it's a totally unjustified belief. I haven't actually read the guy. I haven't like, done my homework in terms of figuring out if he's actually like saying interesting or legitimate
Yeah.
things or not. It's just
Right.
kind of, I know,
Can I
at the
say?
core
Can
of,
I say? Yeah. Can
yeah,
I say?
yeah.
Everybody should find somebody to marry them who thinks about them like Jordan Peterson thinks about himself. That's what I'll say about Jordan Peterson. Okay.
Yeah, so like that get like it's so deeply uncool in my cultural social group to be into Jordan Peterson, right? And that uncoolness has sort of infected my
Mm,
epistemology.
right.
Like I truly believe that he's full of shit, but I don't think I have like legitimate reasons other than that I just feel that he's so deeply uncool
Right.
in my group.
Right.
Um,
I think
so
I
that
think you're
yeah.
being I think you're being hard on yourself.
Yeah.
I think this is a case where you've got sufficient, epistemic justification. I mean, I'm assuming that you've read some things, you've seen some things that he said. I'm assuming it's not one of those cases where like you've never come across any of his intellectual output, and you're
I've
purely
maybe seen
relying on
like,
hearsay.
sure, I've maybe seen like one or two clips of his, but like that's not really sufficient evidence to
Right.
judge an entire
You're
person's
being a
work and
scientist about it.
output.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Sure. Yeah.
like that might not be a representative sample. Surely it was shaped by
Yeah.
people's, desire to make him look bad. Maybe it was taken out of context. Like I don't know. I feel like I don't have enough evidence to be confident one way or another, and yet I'm
Mm,
confident. I don't know.
mm,
It's a
Yeah.
weird
yeah.
schizophrenia in myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although,
Oh, okay. Sorry,
Yeah.
dude.
oh,
Yeah.
really quickly on that.
Yeah.
I mean, you might say you've got kind of higher order evidence in as much as there are
Yeah.
people who you trust who think that.
Right.
Hmm.
Right.
And often that's how we form beliefs. Even if you take away these sort of impression management concerns and status competition, um, we don't have firsthand experience of most of the things that we form beliefs about, and so we
That's
just
true.
rely
Yeah.
upon people that we trust to be good information sources. And if you're in I'm not saying this is necessarily what's going on in your case. It could just be pure, this guy's uncool within your kind of prestige economy, but it could also be the case that you're surrounded by people that you think are smart and generally sort of thoughtful when it comes to evaluating whether people are intellectually worthwhile, and you trust those people. And I think those sorts of explanations are often quite difficult to tease apart. The case in which
Hmm.
you form a belief for its social benefits because it's going to make you look good, because that's the kind of the socially enforced orthodoxy within your reference network, distinguishing that from cases in which no, you are trying to get at the truth, but you just forced to rely upon kind of the higher order evidence of what people in your social network take to be the case.
Hmm.
I think disentangling those two things is quite difficult in some cases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah. Totally.
Dan, one question we've asked people, and to sort of maybe move things in a slightly different direction, just for a little bit at least, is how did you get interested in this? Many people we've talked to have sort of had an origin story, either with taking an evolutionary approach, but then also sort of a reason for why they study what they study. And I'm imagining people sort of wondering, you're interested in belief and its social strategic function. And, not to psychoanalyze you or yourself, but I mean, have you thought about sort of when you're thinking about these phenomena, is there do you either have like a life experience, or was there something about, you looked out in the world and you're like, this is weird or unjust or just strange? Like what do you have some notion of sort of why this particular thing and not study something else?
Hmm. Um, so, I mean, I guess one part of that is why am I interested in the application of evolutionary ideas to psychology and behavior, which I think is quite, let's say, unusual for a humanities academic.
Yeah.
And there, who knows what the actual causes are, but the kind of the boring story which strikes me as plausible is just that when I was a teenager, I read books by Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, a little bit later on Dan Dennett, and since the minute I came across these ideas, the moment I came across these ideas, I just found them incredibly, almost obviously compelling
Mm.
in a way that's never really been replicated in other areas of intellectual inquiry. Learning about evolution by natural selection, uh, just this sort of profound transformation in how I understood the world. And then also, more specifically, the idea that, applying evolutionary theory to understanding our minds and our behavior and our societies, that would be fruitful. Again, just struck me as obvious from the moment I came across this. But that was young. And then I went into sort of university and eventually did a PhD and went into academia in the humanities. And there's this strange thing where, I assumed learning this stuff as a teenager that this is just like what I, uncontroversial picture of what human beings are like, in as much as we're products of evolution by natural selection, and that fact is relevant to understanding our behavior. I assume that was just the kind of consensus view among all smart people for the most part, with some exceptions here and there. And then when I went into academia as someone in the humanities, I mean, you'll both know this very well, it was this shock to me that evolutionary psychology, even understood in a really broad sense, is incredibly stigmatized. People are actively hostile to it. Which I found just baffling and continue to find really baffling. And so that's sort of the origin story of how I got into evolutionary psychology in a way that I think is kind of unusual for a humanities academic. I just came across these ideas really early on. And before I could have been indoctrinated, I think, by the kind of, humanities style view of evolutionary psychology.
Mm.
And then in terms of my like specific research interests, I don't know. I feel like the truth there is just really boring and mundane, which is that certain things I found interesting. I read
Sure.
certain people, I found their arguments persuasive.
Yeah. Path
And also,
dependency sort of. Yeah. Yeah.
within academia, it's this, sort of status game to come up with kind of interesting and engaging ideas. And so you try to find those aspects of the literature that you think are most promising
Right.
for generating new ideas. And especially if you've got a kind of rich theoretical framework that you can use to generate a few different ideas. And again, in that context, I found, kind of evolutionary cognitive science, social science, in the broadest possible sense of those terms, just incredibly fruitful.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the story.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's great. And I mean, I think one of the other things that people might be listening, especially people who aren't familiar with your work, we've talked about evolution not being a just so story, and we have talked about examples of taking an approach and have an idea of like the underlying function of this phenomenon is X. That makes additional predictions. We can test that.
Mm.
Um, do you have an example of when you talk about this to people or of your work where that functionalist approach that's saying that the underlying function of this weird thing is this other thing. And when we think about that and understand that, it makes predictions or gives us insight. Do you have an example of that for people who might not know your work that well?
So I think what we've been talking about in terms of motivated reasoning, what gets called self-deception, and so on, within philosophy, sort of philosophy of mind, there's still this, I think, quite strong commitment to the you can't handle the truth model. Of these sorts of beliefs that we believe things that we want to be true, that protect our self-esteem, that help us regulate our emotions, and so on. And, I've been pushing for a long time, this is not really original. This is drawing on the work of, David and Robert Trivers and Robert Wright and Richard Alexander and so on. Firstly, the idea that, as we've already talked about, that's just very implausible from an evolutionary perspective. And that, I think, should count against it. It doesn't rule it out definitively, because we do things to regulate our emotions and sort of hedonic self-manipulation and so on. But at the very least, in terms of thinking about things in a careful, sort of rigorous way, theoretically, it's sort of mark against it, in as much as this is very bizarre as a view from an evolutionary perspective.
Mhm.
But then also, if you take a kind of a goal which makes a lot more evolutionary sense, as we've been talking about, something like advocacy or
Mhm.
propaganda, where the goal is not to adjust your own psychological state, but to influence other agents and their mental states in advantageous ways. I think if you then understand lots of these biased beliefs as being wrapped up with these motivations towards advocacy, that can then, not only does it have this sort of evolutionary plausibility, I think it explains a whole suite of patterns that we see that you don't get from the I can't handle the truth model of
Mhm.
self-deception. One of them, and you've written about this, I can't remember exactly where, David, but it's the fact that often we're biased to believe things that we don't want to be true in a way that's very confusing. If you've got this, you can't handle the
Yeah.
truth model of
Yeah.
self-deception, like believing that there are witches engaging in these like orgiastic gatherings, under cover of
Mhm.
night against the community. That's
Hmm.
not something people believe for reasons of emotional comfort. Believing
Yeah.
in hell, it's not the kind of thing people believe so it makes them feel good about the world. Believing that the rival group is this incredibly threatening, malevolent force, it's not going to, make you sleep better at night. These are often quite distressing beliefs,
Yeah.
but in each of those cases, they serve these sort of propagandistic purposes, right? If you can
Hmm.
demonize someone as a witch, you send a signal about your intentions towards them, you denigrate their reputation. If you can portray a rival group as being incredibly threatening and dangerous, well, that's useful propaganda. So it makes
Hmm.
sense that we'll be biased towards those kinds of beliefs, even if it's not something that would like to be true. And I also think it explains why we sort of touched on this a little bit already, but why when it comes to sort of motivated cognition, these cases where our practical motivations bias our beliefs, there seems to be this sort of rationalization constraint where, generally we're only going to internalize something in as much as we can find sort of epistemic justifications for it. If we can find evidence and arguments that are consistent with that idea, even if they're not good, judged objectively. And again, I think that kind of makes sense on a sort of propagandistic, rationale. If the goal of these beliefs is to be spread and to persuade and to propagandize, then it makes sense that you would try to recruit selectively evidence and arguments in favor of them. Whereas if the goal is merely to indulge in this sort of, masturbatory wishful thinking, it's very unclear why you would need to recruit these forms of evidence and arguments.
Hmm.
So off the top of my head, I mean that sort of those arguments in different places have been made before, but I think it's a really clear case where taking a kind of evolutionary perspective that says, look, here's this striking thing about human psychology. Let's try to explain it in terms of the goals that would actually make sense from an evolutionary perspective, including the perspective of what are the actual selection pressures that we confronted ancestrally, which had to do with playing these complex social games. So
Hmm.
start with that as your kind of your guiding set of priors, and then building on that, show how it illuminates many aspects of this phenomenon that would otherwise be quite puzzling. That's something that sort of jumps to mind as a really good case, where I think taking this broad evolutionary perspective really helps to illuminate something which is sort of central to the human condition, and I think widely misunderstood by people who don't bother with the evolutionary perspective at all.
Yeah. And when you think about beliefs, or I think we've talked, David and I have talked a bit about cynical approaches to ourselves, and in some sense it's sort of humbling because it applies to ourselves, right? And it's sort of being like, well, what am I, what do I believe? And I think all of us who take an evolutionary approach as professionals, I mean, to varying degrees, we sort of have our work hat and life hat. But I'm wondering, like, for you, and I'm for people listening, and David, this question is for you too, because I think you guys both are sort of the world experts on this. Um, when you're thinking about social biases or propagandistic biases, or even if we get rid of the word bias and just say, like, the reason why we do these things is for these reasons, um, do you find yourself, like, in a day-to-day way, sort of like, is it helpful? Like, I think some people might think it's sort of oppressive and cynical. Do you actually find it liberating or a nice check on sort of just double checking your assumptions? Like, David is going to go and read 2 hours worth of Jordan Peterson after this, I'm sure. Um, like that kind of, like, are there, for people listening who might just think it's all cynical and sort of you're just trying to say people are stupid, like, what, I'm not saying you're saying that, or either of you, and I know you guys both are very explicit about the opposite point. But yeah, do you know what I'm getting at? Like, how do you think about, what's what tools does this give you in your day-to-day existence that people might want to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in David's view on this as well, because obviously it's something he's thought a massive amount about. So I guess there's a question of what do we gain from this sort of perspective on belief specifically, and then what might we gain from a sort of more cynical view of human motivation in general. What I would say is, I mean, this is a framework for thinking about our psychology and our behavior that is, part of the scientific project. Um, so, it needn't be the case that the things we learn in science would benefit us in the ordinary interactions we're having with each other. There's no a priori reason why that should be the case. Um, and it's not obvious to me that you do kind of benefit from having these sorts of like understanding of the deeper causes of your beliefs and the way in which you think and reason in terms of just ordinary social life. If I think about
Mhm.
like would my mum benefit from having an understanding of socially adaptive beliefs? Almost certainly not. I don't think she'd like positively like benefit in her practical life. It might even be disadvantageous in various ways. But in the
Mhm.
scientific project, we're trying to understand the way that the world really is, and that's important because sometimes it really matters to understand the way that the world really is. And this is something maybe we can get into. But the reason I think it's important is when it comes to stepping back and thinking about society, thinking about social organization, thinking about the kinds of political projects that are likely to work, and thinking more reflectively about the human condition. Those are cases in which I think it's really important to have an accurate understanding of what's going on. And that's where I would place the value of this kind of perspective. It might have value in terms of making us more reflective about our own biases and so on, but I think that's a slightly more complex case, and I wouldn't assume that there must be a practical value in knowing the truth, given that the whole point is actually we often advance our interests by not following the truth in a disinterested way. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, but I'm interested in your views, David, as well.
Yeah, that was really well put down. I agree with 100% of it, and I'm inclined to say the exact same things. Um, yeah, I love the point that we shouldn't automatically assume that knowledge of the truth is going to be personally advantageous to us, especially if concealing the truth is often advantageous to us, as we've been talking about pretty much this whole time. So, yeah, has it been advantageous to me? I don't know that it has like leaked into my personal life enough for me to really say because there are sort of two hats you can put on. You can put on your scientist hat, your philosopher hat, and think about the human condition on an abstract level, and then you can just do your day-to-day chores and live your day-to-day life, and do the dishes or whatever, and then that part of your brain is just turned off. So I don't know that it has affected my day-to-day life that much. Occasionally, it gives me more insight into why people do things. It helps me avoid bullshit, I think, better, and to better understand where it comes from and how to avoid it. One thing I've noticed is that it makes me less surprised by things happening in the world. I think that's often a good way of checking whether your world model
Mm.
is accurate, is that if you're less surprised by things, because that's a sign that your predictions are coming true a lot, and you have a good predictive model. If you're constantly surprised and taken aback by everything, that's a sign that you have a pretty crappy predictive model
Like
of
you're a
how the world
baby.
works.
You're a
Yeah,
baby. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
exactly.
you're
Yeah.
like a baby. So with the political chaos surrounding the Trump stuff recently, with the whipsawing between different views on the tariffs and different justifications that the Republicans are launching into. Like first, the tariffs are great, and you don't have to worry about prices increasing. Consumerism is really just a bad thing. These crazy about faces that we're seeing politically right now, people have come to me like, wow, I can't believe this is happening. Like, isn't this such amazing evidence for alliance theory? I'm like, oh yeah, I barely noticed it on it. Like it didn't surprise me at all. Like it just kind of was part of the background radiation of my life because it was just so expected to me that these kinds of propagandistic responses would pop up. Uh, and so maybe that's a bad thing. Like maybe I should be more surprised by this. And maybe that surprise is doing something for people and like motivating them to engage in more political activism. I don't know. Um, but that's one way in which it has affected me. Yeah, there's lots more to say on this topic. I don't know that I've said everything, but that's
Yeah.
that's what comes to the top of my head. Yeah.
Yeah, and a related question is sort of how, and Dan, this is more for you because you're the guest, but I am also interested in what David has to say, is how do people react to this, whether professionally, the people that you're, arguing with professionally, or also just sort of day to day, because you're telling them something that we're talking about is sort of intrinsically revealing, it's pulling the curtain back on us. And, as we've already talked about and alluded to, there's probably good reasons for our evolved psychology to not like that revelation. So, and
Mm,
again, you're kind of
yeah.
working, you're basically on this theory. The science of doing this should be sort of aversive to people. Is that prediction borne out, or are there enough people, maybe at least in your professional day to day, that they've trained themselves enough to sort of appreciate what you're doing? What's the temperature on the street in terms of the reception to the work?
Hmm. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah.
I think that so my view is everyone is biased when it comes to thinking about the world for many of the reasons that we've talked about, and um, for me that's a kind of insight of modern science. And I mean that sounds like grandiose, but I think on a certain interpretation of what it is to be biased, I think we've got enough evidence now that like scientists should sign on to that being the case. Um, and yeah, there are whole parts of the sciences where if you suggest the possibility that like research might be subject to certain kinds of biases, there's this explosive reaction. So we haven't really talked about this today, but one of the areas I'm kind of interested in as a philosopher of science is modern misinformation research, where
Hmm.
people try to study the nature, the causes, the sort of prevalence, the consequences of something called misinformation, and also things like disinformation and so on. And that's interesting because I think it exists at two levels. At one level, there's the question of what we've been talking about, which is why do people believe what they believe, and why do people sometimes believe false things and things that aren't supported by the evidence. But you can also ask those questions about the people who are studying misinformation. And so I've pointed out various ways in which I think this field is often kind of biased in terms of the examples of misinformation it focuses on, how it focuses on the topic. And, there's been a pretty negative reaction to some of that among people within that field. And I think that generalizes more broadly. I think lots of people in the social sciences, even though they're happy to when they're describing, the hoi polloi, the great unwash, the kind of ordinary people, to point at these various biases that sort of corrupt their cognitive processes and interfere with how they view the world. If there's the suggestion that they, as researchers, might also be human beings who are subject to these sorts of biases, there's often this incredibly kind of explosive reaction. So that's maybe one area where it has resulted in backlash. But I think there are also just people who, for whatever reason, find these ideas interesting and compelling. And after all, like within the social sciences, within intellectual inquiry, we are ostensibly playing this status game where we care about the truth and we care about, what's supported by evidence and arguments. And like within that context, I think it can often be, quite alluring to come across these sorts of ideas, which will better help illuminate certain kinds of phenomena. So those are the things kind of that immediately jump to mind. But I mean, you both also, I guess, must have encountered similar things. David, because you're an outright self-described cynic, and Dave, because you're an evolutionary psychologist, which people often think of as being cynical. So I'd be interested what you two think as well.
Yeah.
For me, I think the fact that I almost kind of play a character on everything is bullshit. I
Right.
think that gives me some cover that like
Yeah.
people know that it's kind of tongue in cheek and I get less backlash because of that. So I found that that's a pretty good strategy in terms of avoiding backlash, just to sort of be playful about it
Mm.
and try to find the humor in it. I think that has been very helpful for me in sort of helping the medicine of this message go down. But and also just writing versus saying it out loud is often helpful. Like if I say some of these things out loud, I often, get, dirty looks or whatever. But if I write them, it's all of a sudden a different medium and I don't have to deal with people's facial expressions because I don't see them. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly, I mean, hostility against evolutionary approaches is ubiquitous. It's certainly gotten better in the past few decades, but it's still there. And the hostility against evolution, hostility against cynicism, and when you combine them, you get double hostility. But I don't know. Part of me kind of likes it though. Like if everyone perfectly agrees with everything I say and there's no disagreement and I'm not like challenging anything, like it's just boring. So part of me kind of likes the thrill of pushing back against the conventional wisdom. So it's a mixed bag, I'd say. I don't know. What do you
Yeah.
think, Dave?
I like that last part, and I think I often I talk about this story of like I one of my good friends at the Max Planck when I first met him, he's like I hate evolutionary psychology, and I was like great. I sat down eagerly and was like I pulled up a chair for him, and I was like, tell me why you hate it, because like I thought I hated it when I first encountered it too, and like it turns out that he hated what I hated, and actually we agreed essentially like he had a misrepresentation and so for me, maybe it's sort of like David's not surprised, where it's so much in the water. The default is it's going to be misunderstood. And so for me, it's sort of like I'm an anthropologist of sort of like, oh, do I understand this particular instance of the misunderstanding? And it's not that I'm sort of like, trying to convert everybody, but it's just sort of like trying to map like, like does this person have a good faith effort trying to understand something and they're misinformed? Is it just that it's a status game and they just don't like the people? Do they have a good reason for that or not? And that informs sort of like, do I try? But for me, I just sort of view it as an interesting scientific enterprise, but I still do get like worked up. Although as like we had Deb Lieberman on and she said, as you get older, and not everything is life or death. Not every paper that's get rejected. The beginning when you're a grad student and you're like, you think, okay, I have a really good argument. It still hurts to get a paper rejected. Like I know David and I just had, we both had like really big important papers that we think are really important get rejected for I think really dumb reasons. That
Yeah.
always hurts no matter what your approach is. And so, I think that always hurts. But, as each one is less important, then I think, I just sort of it's just again, as David said, it's just sort of part of the expectation for
Mm.
me at least. Yeah. For the misinformation one, Dan, do you think that it's because people think you are have an agenda, um, and that like what do you have you thought about sort of why people are pushing back against it?
Maybe I do have an agenda. I mean, maybe there is a set of motivations which I'm not,
Well, a particular
motivated
agenda. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
acknowledge.
Yeah.
It's complicated. I mean, a lot of it is it's yeah. I mean, that's such a complicated sort of can of worms to open.
Sure.
I mean, just to focus on one part of it, psychology and the social sciences overwhelmingly skew towards the left. Sort of liberal left politics. And, I think your prior should be that if you've got an entire field where people share political allegiances, that's going to influence the ways in which they seek out, interpret, evaluate, process information, and so on, conduct studies, operationalize things, how they measure things, etc. And then I think that should be your prior, based on general models of human psychology. And then I think when you look at misinformation research, just as you look at many aspects of the modern social sciences where they're studying sort of politically relevant things, I think you find lots of cases where these sorts of, progressive ideas, values, partisan allegiances influence the kind of research that they're doing. And, there's this sort of familiar set of coalitional dynamics where if you point that out, the inference people are going to draw on is you're not on the right team.
Right.
So there was an article in Time magazine published recently, which links one of my articles as an example of someone defending the authoritarian agenda, i.e.,
Right. Right.
defending
Right.
Donald Trump and MAGA and so on, and his attacks
Right.
on institutions, which, for anyone who knows anything about my political views, I find absolutely absurd. It's not at all a political coalition that I've got any sympathy for. But nevertheless, the idea is if you're criticizing, or at least if you're even just pointing out that there is a kind of liberal bias in this research in such a heated, polarized political context, then familiar coalitional dynamics are going to kick in, and it's going to be, well, like you're either with us or you're against us, right? If you're criticizing us in this way, you must be trying to support the other team.
Right. Right.
And I think that makes sense in the context of ordinary kind of partisan debate. I think it's unfortunate that even there for various reasons, but I think it's so destructive to science because
Yeah.
science, its esteem within society, which I think is, deserved for the most part, is wrapped up with the fact that it's our best way of escaping these kinds of partisan biases. We try to institutionalize various procedures and we try to enforce various sorts of norms, which are going to enable us to overcome these sorts of, familiar forms of coalitional politics to try to get at the truth. And I think it's a real big problem for science, both in terms of its capacity to generate knowledge, but also in terms of its public reputation, if it's seen as being subject to the same forces that apply when it comes to ordinary partisan politics. I've forgotten what the question is now, but that's
No,
one
that's
case of
yeah,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Just no, it was like sort of why or what, yeah, why people do push back against it. And I mean, just to sort of follow up on that, I think like if you're saying that like misinformation research is skewing in a particular way, one inference is like, well, you're for the other side. It's interesting that the inference isn't, well, what are the ways in which our values we're not living up to, right? Like, I mean, it would be
Mm,
nice if that was sort of the way people approach things. I mean, for reasons like David studies, that's typically not. It's rare, but I mean, you know, I think that would be the ideal, would be to sort of say, you know, if we really think if we really do hold these values, what would we predict in pointing out ways in which we're not being consistent, as David has documented well. It's sort of it's being coalitional. I think that's a good adjective, right? Is to sort of and this is for me actually, for me this is actually gets back to this question of like what do I use my work for? And I often check myself just being, am I being coalitional about this, right? Like it feels
mm,
good to sort of defend my side, but then I'm like, but is this a situation where I'm taking sides as opposed to taking a principle, right? And there's many
mm,
times throughout, especially like if I look on social media or these things that are not just sort of dispassionate, like quote unquote boring scientific issues, but these charged issues, they're very coalitional. Of course, that's why they're charged. That's where I often find myself sort of checking myself. And I do this thing of like, I almost flip the coalitional side where it's like, you know, if the other political party that I support said this, what would I think? You know, or if it's something
mm,
my political party says, I flip it into like try to simulate as best I can. If this was coming from the other side, what would I think? I think like that's
mm,
a useful heuristic. And so it's not surprising that when you're presenting something that is, you're saying it's skewed, that there's a concern. I mean, you would predict it, right? That there's a concern about like whose side are you on and what's your agenda. But it's interesting that it plays out that way.
mm.
I, I'm curious, Dan. I feel like one stop on this train of examining our biases is a kind of epistemic nihilism. And I don't mean epistemic nihilism in the sense that truth is impossible to achieve. I don't mean epistemic nihilism in that, you know, there aren't institutions that can more or less reliably produce true information. I mean epistemic nihilism in the sense that me personally, I, David Pinsoff, have no hope of knowing what's true, right?
Yeah.
I can wrap my head around the idea that as a society, if there are cultural evolutionary processes or incentives, that will societally push us toward true beliefs, or maybe it'll push the institution of science toward true beliefs. I can get behind that. But everything we know about our own psychology and our epistemology suggests that truth, if it exists, is an emergent phenomenon.
Mm,
It emerges from cooperative groups and institutions that are well designed. It is not a product of any individual human. No individual human is likely to have all the answers. Most individual humans have their own biases, their own agendas, their own limitations. So when I reflect on that, the ultimate conclusion is that I, David Pinsoff, have no hope of achieving the thing that I want most, which is to know what's true.
mm,
And that to me is really distressing.
mm.
So what do you think about that? Has that occurred to you? How do you deal with that? Soothe me.
Yeah. I can't soothe you, unfortunately. It's a great
Oh,
Watch some
question.
Jordan Peterson, David.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe he's the
Just
answer.
throwback
Yeah.
to
He'll disabuse you of this
exactly.
humility.
Jordan Peterson
Um,
knows what's true. Yeah.
yeah, I've written a few pieces sort of grappling with that, and I don't have a particularly satisfactory answer. Although interestingly, I'm not really bothered by it in the way that you seem to be bothered by it. So I think
Hmm.
if I step back, I think yeah, I'm biased in ways
Yeah.
that in some ways I'm probably vaguely aware of, and some ways I'm less aware of. And it's almost certainly true that I've got a very selective partial picture of the world and I'm fallible in all these different ways. So I do think a certain kind of skepticism is correct. I do think we tend to be absurdly overconfident about our capacity to know the world, especially when it comes to these sort of heated social and political phenomena. Um, and I think that's just true. I think it's something you have to sort of face up to. In a way, the fact that you're facing up to it, I think, is it's a good signal of the fact that you're more reflective about these sorts of things than the average person. And one maybe small area where I disagree is you said that sort of knowledge is a consequence of not sort of individual level cognition, but these broader norms and institutions. And I think that's exactly right. But I'll just add that I do think there are individual differences in cognition. Often I think they're downstream of the social norms that get enforced in particular communities. Like if you're in a community where it's expected of you that you're going to provide evidence and arguments, at least of some kind, when you state a view, it's
Hmm.
expected of you that you're going to acknowledge uncertainty if you want to win a good reputation and so on. You're going to end up with a, I think, more accurate understanding of topics than somebody who belongs to a community where those sorts of norms aren't enforced. So even though I
Hmm.
think you're right that the social is kind of primary, given that you inhabit a certain kind of social and institutional context, I think it can have sort of consequences in terms of your individual cognition.
Hmm.
Um, but I agree with the basic point, which is, yeah, if you step back and you reflect on your epistemic situation, to use the kind of pretentious philosophical term, but your situation with respect to your ability to acquire knowledge about the world, you should embrace a kind of skepticism. But what are you going to do with that? You have to participate in this game of life, right? You have to make the
Yeah.
best case you can in accordance with the norms that are in your environment for the kinds of views that you take to be true. You have to try to live up to the ideals that are going to be relevant to seeming like a good member of your epistemic community and so on. And I think you can do those things even as you acknowledge that you're biased and probably wrong in various respects, and you don't exactly know what respects they're going to be. I mean, certainly when I write a blog post, I mean, I could write a 50,000 word blog post, adding all these qualifications about how I'm not, maybe I'm biased here, of course, all of these different ways. I think what I'm arguing for is going to be a selective and somewhat biased understanding of the world that I'm trying to present, but it doesn't really have much value in terms of injecting that into the conversation in many cases. You just sort of do your best in a relatively humble way to argue for certain kinds of viewpoints and see what the response is. That's not a very satisfying response to your question, but that's, I guess, currently how I'm thinking of things.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I like that response. Just remembering, I mean, you had a wonderful post called the "Everyone is Biased" bias about how
Mm,
it's possible to take these ideas about human bias too far to a point where you're flattening human variation, as you put it. It's
mm,
often easy to lose sight of the fact that human variation is large and significant and important, and that there are pretty large differences in epistemic character, differences in moral character, and those differences matter, and we should attend to them. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that when your focus is on human nature. It's easy to forget about human variation, just because that's just not the thing that you're focusing. You're thinking about the stuff that we all share as humans. You necessarily will forget about the stuff that differs between people when you embark on that project. So I thought that was a really beautiful point. And so I guess I can comfort myself with the knowledge that maybe I'm one of the better humans epistemically, and maybe I'm in one of the better cultures, which unfortunately sounds just as self-serving.
Well, or
yeah.
or maybe
Yeah.
maybe David, you're trying to be less. You're in the path dependency that as we all are. You're just sort of like what looks to be the best, what looks
Mm.
better, what's less wrong, right?
That's true. Yeah, taking the marginal perspective and the relative, looking at things relative to their alternatives rather than relative to perfection,
Yeah.
is also a healthier way of looking at things.
Yeah, at the risk of poking the minefield, I do want to turn back one more time to the disinformation concern, though, too. And this is again sort of for both of you. Is Dan, I was reflecting on what you had said earlier, in you talking about why people sort of thinking you might have an agenda for pointing this thing out about the disinformation literature. Um, the idea that, and you even mentioned some people did use what you said to argue for something you weren't espousing, right? Like that people sort of picked up on it to make other to make arguments. Like this is an example of like support for these ideas that you don't hold, right? Incorrectly.
That
Yeah.
was the accusation that I was
Right.
that in
Exactly.
publishing
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
works defending. I don't know. I
Yeah.
can't. I mean, no evidence was provided. I mean, in a way, it's absurd the
Right.
idea that Trump would be, or anyone that's sort of in that
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
faction
Yeah.
would be looking at the
Yeah.
obscure
Yeah.
Substack posts of an
Yeah,
academic
yeah.
philosopher
But I'm
posting
wondering,
like
like,
a.
is that sort of like just to look at it as a scientific perspective? Like, do you think that's like the rational concern, right? Is that like if we're just scientists about this phenomenon, that like
Mm,
their evolved psychology is concerned that is like, what does this afford me in my interests, right? Could this be used against us, right? Like, do you
mm.
think that that's, I mean, in some sense, that's almost, the idea that at least, you or David are sort of, it's that there's a social, it's really being looked at in the social coalitional instrumental way.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what you two think about this as well, because I've been thinking about this a lot recently. This idea of objecting to a claim or an argument not on its merits, but on the basis that it might be weaponized in a way that people object to. Um,
Right.
Mm.
so, which is a very common thing, So at the
Yeah.
moment that there are these, in the US, these attacks from the Trump administration on these elite universities like Harvard, and there are some people who have come out, or they've said this in the past, with arguments to the effect that, look, there are real problems with these institutions. They do have certain kinds of political biases. There is certain forms of groupthink, etc. These sorts of arguments. And one response to those arguments is to say, here's why they're wrong, right? Another response to those arguments is to say, those criticisms of these institutions are being weaponized by this administration, which is
Mhm.
engaging in these sorts of bad behaviors.
Right.
And that's a reason not to make those arguments. Like I've seen loads of
Mhm.
that. Steven Pinker recently published an article in the New York Times, and where he sort of says, look, there are real problems with Harvard. He sort of talks about things that he's mentioned in the past. But nevertheless, he explicitly says he thinks what the Trump administration is doing is really bad. And lots of the criticisms I saw where it's like, well, you're kind of responsible for, or at least you've played a role in defending, or your arguments have been instrumentalized for this bad thing.
Mm,
Ergo, that's something that you should be held accountable for. And I guess what you can say is, if you step back, there is at least something to the idea that when you advance claims or arguments, you probably should be, at least in some contexts, sensitive to the possibility that they're going to get weaponized in nefarious ways.
right.
In some contexts, it would be reasonable to hold you accountable to that. Like
Right. Right.
if you set up a social media account and all it is videos of like racial minorities committing crimes,
Right.
even if every
Yeah.
video is real,
Yeah.
I think it'd be
Yeah.
reasonable to
Yeah.
say,
Yeah. 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 You
you're doing
haven't
this
you
in a way
haven't
that's
dotted every
clearly
I on
going
that
to.
line of inferences, but yeah, we know what you're
Yeah.
saying. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
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 So I think in some contexts it's reasonable, but I also think the norm that says you shouldn't assert something that you take to be true, or you shouldn't make an argument, lest it be used by the wrong side, lest
Mm,
it be instrumentalized in a nefarious way by people that you might disagree with and you might explicitly disagree with, is
mm,
so corrosive in general
Mhm.
to knowledge generation, to the pursuit of truth. It's such a recipe for groupthink. If
Yeah.
whenever somebody criticizes your group, you can say, you're just defending or supporting the other side. So I don't quite know what to think about it, because I think if you really steelman these arguments about weaponization, you can think of cases where they might have a point. But as a general norm, this idea that you should be able to criticize a claim or an argument not on its merits, but merely because you think it might be instrumentalized by the other side, seems to me
Yeah.
it's like totally corrosive to the pursuit of truth and the sorts of norms and procedures that we should care about in truth-seeking institutions. That's my current thought, but I'll be interested
yeah.
what you two
I
think.
mean, just as a quick follow-up, I mean, do you think, because this sounds also very familiar in terms of like a conversation, right? Where like a lot of times a claim is made and what is implied, is it's almost it comes back to this thing of like inferences. There's a lot of inferences based on
Mm,
any one thing we say, like we still don't have an AI system that if it actually represents a statement is like actually percolates all the correct inferences. It doesn't have the semantic common sense knowledge to draw these inferences. And so in a conversation, if I say something often, so like Dan, you might be like, well, did you mean this or this? And I'll be like, no, 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 I don't actually agree with this thing. I'm just pointing out this other problem. And I wonder
mm,
sometimes if like what you're describing is sort of the scaled up version of what ordinarily for our evolved psychology would be the right thing to do, which is it's sort of like a conversation of like, okay, Dan, I hear you that I'm just going to take the other the devil's advocate side of sort of I hear you that there is a objective skew in terms of like representation politically, um, but there's a concern that this could be used for other reasons that are not advancing science at all. Are you backing that, or are you making a point that advances science? And to the extent that the representation that should advance science, which I might even disagree with, is that the thing, like, is your North Star science, or is it this other status game? In an
mm,
interpersonal conversation, we can do that really quick. And I sometimes wonder if things like social media or things where we can't have a conversation back and forth, it perpetuates a thing where you sort of feel like you're a bad guy because they don't understand where you're coming from, and they haven't understood where you're coming from, and you may not understand that maybe this is some people's motivation and maybe some people's not. I mean, we all
mm,
know that there are people even within our community that they're like, science, my personal status, like, hold my beer, I'm going to go with personal status, right? Like the people who are sort of trolls and like sort of advance their
Yeah.
status on the backs of a correct
Yeah.
understanding of even what we do. And we're like, we all know, like, we're like, oh, we hate those people, or like, well, we like them interpersonally, but wish they wouldn't do that. Um, and so so that's my long-winded way of saying, like, I wonder sometimes if this is almost an example of almost a mismatch in terms
mm,
of the communicative back and forth that in under more maybe sort of ecologically valid, sort of Gricean, communicative, pragmatic ways would sort of quickly eliminate like, what is your status game? I think a lot of communication is sort of like figuring out like, what's your game here, buddy, right? And
mm,
then it's sort of like, are you cool? I'm cool. You're cool. Like that's kind of what I did with the person who was like, I hate Ev Psych. I was like, okay, what's your game? Are you actually interested in what's true, or are you just like interested in like shooting down something and making yourself feel better? And in the second that we both realized that we were both interested in just like a good faith effort, then we were cool. And it was like, so I wonder
mm.
sometimes if that's what goes on.
Yeah. I think it's probably a large part of it. But I think in these cases that I'm thinking of here, there's also this fact that it occurs in a highly polarized
Yeah.
partisan conflict.
Right.
And I think you're right. When you communicate anything, people are going to draw inferences about your motivations. Um, and for me, then the question should be, what are the norms that we want in institutions like universities? Right? What are going to
Yeah.
be conducive to those universities performing their function? And I take the sort of telos, the function of universities, to be basically kind of epistemic, like to produce knowledge, understanding, truth, and so on. And I think, and even when it comes to like mainstream media, I think similarly they also have kind of epistemic functions. And I think there should be a strong presumption against criticizing claims or arguments not based on the kind of merits of those claims or arguments, but because they might be used as ammunition by another political faction.
Mhm.
It seems to me that's, first of all, um, I think there are going to be such strong motivations to uh, criticize claims and arguments for mundane partisan reasons, which should be frowned upon within the context of science. and mainstream media and these other sort of epistemic institutions. Um, and secondly, it just strikes me as a kind of recipe for groupthink and institutional decay. If people can't
Yeah.
criticize these institutions without that being criticized because it might give ammunition to the wrong side in a political conflict, that seems like it's not going to be good for those institutions in terms of their function of seeking knowledge and so on. So I haven't fully thought things through. That's my kind of current intuition about these cases. But yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me like what you're saying, Dan, is that the argument that we shouldn't promote ideas that can be weaponized is itself a good argument. It's just that when you apply it to itself, it destroys itself. So the idea that we shouldn't promote ideas that can be weaponized can itself be weaponized, and
Mm,
that we should count on it to be weaponized because we're coalitional primates who have agendas, and if we can defend our coalitions by criticizing any idea that could be conceivably construed as a weapon, then we can just dismiss anything that challenges our coalitional narratives. It's an unsustainable norm that it can be exploited in the same way that allowing anyone to censor speech can be exploited by bad actors who will inevitably censor ideas that interfere
mm,
with their agendas. This idea that we should only promote ideas that have good consequences and avoid bad consequences, or that cannot be weaponized, like that itself can be weaponized and can be
mm.
exploited by bad actors to protect cherished narratives. So I think it's another example of how cynicism can be a good thing when you start thinking at a broader level of what kinds of norms are sustainable given our cynical motives, given that we can count on, coalitional primates like us to abuse and exploit the power to censor or the power to dismiss ideas on the basis of their consequences. Given that we know this about us, what are the best norms that are sustainable and that are conducive to producing knowledge and truth? And as soon as we abandon this cynicism or apply it selectively to our rivals but not ourselves, then we get into a bad place. And so this is one area where I think cynicism can be a good thing when thinking about the broader social incentives and institutions and norms that we're designing.
Yeah, great point. Can completely agree with that. And actually, it sort of, as you say, gets back to this issue of when can a sort of sensitivity to the ways in which cognition can be biased, when can that be helpful? Well, when we are ostensibly constructing, communities and institutions, the function of which is to generate knowledge, that's a specific context in which actually it's very useful to identify those cases in which certain kinds of motivations can bias how people think and reason about the world so that we can flag them and then construct norms and institutional procedures which are designed either to sort of harness them in ways which generate collective knowledge, like pitting people's biases against each other, or that flag them so that you can develop norms that then sort of penalize them. And I think also that's important because when we're talking about the sort of practical advantages of you know, socially motivated cognition and belief and so on, it's practical advantages for the individual who's engaging in that kind of cognition. But in as much as we're cooperating on a project which is not about advancing the interests of specific individuals, but generating something through intellectual collaboration, under those conditions, the capacity to identify features of human psychology that will be threatening to that project, there I think it's really, really helpful.
Yeah,
Totally.
and I think too, like one norm might be to also sort of, there's a world of difference between somebody saying like, something you're factually saying about, the political affiliation of people. I don't want you to say that versus sort of like, will I accept it if you clarify that your interest is not another nefarious agenda, right? And I think that's like a good litmus test, right? Like, what is the actual claim you're making, right? And what is the actual thing you're pushing? And I think that's where having this kind of conversation
Mm,
back and forth is really helpful because I think it kind of will tease apart. I'm going to completely swat down your ability and censor you versus this idea that it's true is perfectly fine and I will accept it. What are the other implicit or explicit inferences that you want to make or not? And let's debate those, right? Like I
Mm,
think that that's the kind of healthy conversation to have. So for example, if there is a political skew in academia, then what of it, right? Like what's the
mm,
consequence and what how does it impact science? Has the historical skew been the other way for a long time? And these are all kind of conversations to have. And there are other
mm,
skews that we're ignoring. So that could be another thing, like to say, look, like we've talked about, David and I talked about like social class is one area where like there's not a lot of people from low social classes that are in
mm,
academia. That blinds the questions that are asked. Philosophy is a great example. Like I kind of laugh at like I look at people who are sort of the like Quine or even Dennett generation. Philosophy is way overrepresented as the phenotypes of people who will give people the benefit of the doubt. It's often like, deep voiced, a posh accent, a white male, right? Like these are people who
right.
are like they stand up in a room and who has like the highest social bargaining power historically, right? Like
Mm,
that has clearly influenced philosophy immensely, right? From
mm,
a first principles perspective, there's lots of reasons why that's true, but that shouldn't be true to the extent that there's equal access to knowledge. Like the fact that like a smart brain who can do an analysis, who can come to new insights, it's probably going to be pretty orthogonal to like your social bargaining power. And it's kind of a problem that like the two sort of go hand in hand, right? Um, and so I think these are all cases where sort of like having conversations about what's the representation of what people look like, or these other things that like we have these evolved primate brains that we care about, but are they getting in the way of good ideas or good science? Like that's a really good conversation to have. And I do
mm,
think so much ink is spilled in not doing that. I sometimes wonder if people are actually interested in science. Like we talked about like a lot of the internet trolls or for even in psych, I sort of get angry at them because they're not arguing for adaptationism. They're not
mm,
arguing for a task analysis. They're arguing political things, right? And I'm like, really, you're using up our social capital that we earned for like a mundane political thing, and it's sort of that's not science, right? Whether or not they have a point politically, which is a different issue. Um, I often wonder if a lot of this, especially social media, these political things, it's almost like there's are you actually interested in the science or do you actually have an agenda? And the people's prior implicitly is so high that you have an agenda that you're not actually doing science, that like it's a wonderful, rare thing to find somebody who's a scientist.
mm.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that seems right.
Yeah. I mean, good faith conversation and debate where people care about arriving at the truth collaboratively is a very rare and precious flower that is hard to cultivate. And there are all sorts of forces arrayed against it. And even once you do get it, it can be infiltrated by mimics and copycats who try to exploit it. It is difficult to achieve, but when it happens, it's beautiful. I think it has happened in the past couple hours as we've been talking,
Mm.
uh, and it has happened on our various episodes here. And I hope we can continue to nurture this flower. So thank you, Dan, for having this awesome conversation with us. I hope we can have you back to have another one at some
Definitely, yeah.
point. And yeah,
That
thanks
sounds
so
great.
much.
And David, I really look forward to hearing from you next time we talk about your deep dive into Jordan Peterson.
I will give you a full report next time. Well, maybe
So
we should just have an entire episode devoted to Jordan Peterson and his luminous insights.
I'm sure that there would be many people. Actually, I'm not even going to finish that sentence. So yeah, but yeah, Dan, thank you so much. It was a fun conversation, and yeah, thank you for good faith effort into sort of uncovering what we all have as sort of these social agendas and what we think and believe. So it was a fun, and I think a representation of it even in our conversation. So thanks so much.
Thank you for the invitation to come on. Big fan of you both. Big fan of the podcast. Best of success in the future.
Thank you so much. We'll pay you after I turn off the recording again.
Whoa, what a fun conversation.
Oh,
I
that
have no
that
idea.
that was great. Yeah.
So we don't know what
We don't know
conversation
it.
that
What?
was,
No,
but
we're breaking the fourth wall again, but that's okay. It's fun to do that. But
uh,
really, David, I did appreciate your all the things you said during this episode as well.
I really appreciated all the things you said as well, Dave. You were really spot on in all the points you made. If you agree with my assessment of Dave and Dave's assessment of me, please say so on social media. Leave us a kind review. And if you feel so inclined, you can check out our Patreon page and support us. Your enthusiasm and support is the fuel that keeps us going.
Yeah,
So,
and a couple
yeah,
people have already said this is their favorite podcast, and even if it's just a couple people's favorite podcast, that means a lot to us. So thank you.
yeah, absolutely.
And without further ado, we'll end the episode here, and then just wait for the next one. And if you're binge listening, it'll be a few seconds, and then we'll start back up.
Yep, cool. Thank you.